Yvonne, are you going to kick off, or Robert, or do you want me to?
I was hoping DB would do it. I mean, DB or Robert.
No. Well, I can welcome everybody to the Digital Culture Speaker Series. Today with us we have Bill Deresiewicz, and to give us the introduction is our Dean of the Harper Institute of Design and the Arts, Stephen Peppers. Stephen, would you like to carry on with the introduction?
Great. Thank you. Welcome to a conversation with Bill Deresiewicz. Bill is one of our nation's really leading thinkers and public intellectuals who's known for his uncomfortable critical analysis. And what I mean by that is that he kicks the tires of dominant narratives. He really wants to uncover unquestioned ideas about our institutions, about technology, about change, about education. His book, Excellent Sheep, which gathered global attention, questioned whether elite higher education was actually preparing graduates to be original thinkers, and more importantly, whether the whole system of higher education was serving our democratic purposes. He turned this critical analysis on the art world, and based on an essay he wrote in The Atlantic in 2015 called The Death of the Artist and the Birth of the Creative Entrepreneur, which I suspect many of you have read. I invited him to ASU in 2016 to address a conference that included hundreds of deans. And his argument, which he'll expand today, argued that our changing marketplace for art, driven largely by new technology, new platforms, new distribution, was sort of hollowing out good jobs for artists, the middle class life for an artist. And instead, artists are facing new inequalities, new pressures, new demands on their time, energies that were taking them away from creative work, making it harder to make a living. It was a message that those arts leaders needed to hear, and we grappled with for the entirety of that conference. So, Bill, a belated thank you for provoking us then. But you turned that provocation into a book called The Death of the Artist, which is based on hundreds of interviews with artists working in a variety of fields. And so I'll just say, in this particular case, we might consider this book and maybe Bill's perspectives to be sort of a techno-pessimist in this critique. I probably lean on the side of being a techno enthusiast, seeing maybe more net positive benefits for cultural life and artists. But even as we may disagree with the broader implications of the trends we're seeing, his perspective is so important, and it's derived from and shared by many, many artists, including many of you who are joining us today. I think in some ways, maybe this is the argument of our time that we must be having. So I'm excited to have this argument, this conversation, this discussion now. Let's start. Let's do this together. Let's hope that we'll have many chances to follow up. Bill taught English at Yale and Columbia before becoming a full-time writer in 2008, and he's written hundreds and hundreds of essays and reviews for the New York Times, the Atlantic, Harper's, many other publications. Truly, it's an honor, Bill, to have you join us. And so welcome. We look forward to hearing your evolving thinking about this important topic.
Thanks very much. It's nice to be back at ASU, if only in spirit, so to speak. And I look forward to the conversation we're going to have after I talk for about 30 minutes. I should say, just responding to what the Dean just said, I'm not against the internet or technology in general. I mean, I think that's kind of a crazy thing to be for or against technology, or even a specific technology like the internet. But in relation to the arts, there's no question that the internet has done all kinds of great things for the arts. What my book is about, and what my talk is about, is specifically one dimension, and that is the economic dimension, the financial dimension, and how the internet and other factors, but mainly the internet, has impacted that for artists. The Dean just mentioned that I like to question narratives. I had never exactly thought of it that way, but that's the perfect lead-in to my prepared remarks because I'm going to start by talking about two competing narratives, two competing stories, and they're stories about earning a living as an artist in the digital age. They are diametrically opposed stories. One comes from Silicon Valley and its allies in the media and academia, and is therefore by far the most prominent one in public discourse. We've been hearing this for going on 30 years now, and it says, there's never been a better time to be an artist. If you've got a laptop, you've got a recording studio. If you've got an iPhone, you've got a movie camera. GarageBand, Final Cut Pro, all the tools are out there. And if production is cheap, distribution is free. It's called the internet. YouTube, Spotify, Instagram, Kindle Direct Publishing. Everyone's an artist. Just tap your creativity and put your stuff out there. And soon you too can make a living doing what you love, just like all those viral stars you read about. That's the first story. The second story comes not from Silicon Valley, but from artists themselves, especially musicians, but also writers, filmmakers, people who do comedy, many kinds of visual artists. Basically any kind of visual artist who does stuff that can be digitized. And that story goes, yeah, you can just put your stuff out there, but who's going to pay you for it? Digital content has been demonetized. Music is free, writing is free, video is free. Even images you put up on Facebook or Instagram are free because people can and do just take them. And by people, I mean, among other people, large companies will take your designs. And no, everyone is not an artist. Making art takes years of dedication, and that requires a means of support. If things don't change, a lot of art will cease to be sustainable. That's the second story. I did not write The Death of the Artist to figure out which story was right. I was already pretty sure that the artist story was right. And doing the book did confirm that it was right. The reason I wrote the book is that given that the artist story is right, that it's really hard to make a living making art now, I wanted to know how people are actually doing it. Are the new conditions tolerable? Are they sustainable? Are they more democratic? That even playing field the internet was supposed to give us. What does it mean, I wanted to know, in specific practical terms, to be an artist in today's economy? Those are the questions I set out to answer, and I answered them by doing about 140 interviews and a lot of reading. And briefly, this is what I found. First, in terms of the broad conditions that shape the arts economy and the financial lives of artists today, there's good news, there's bad news, there's good news, and there's bad news about the good news. The bad news, first of all, is that almost everything pays much less. Freelance writing fees are down, author advances are down, recorded music sales are sharply down, budgets for all but the largest movies are down. And what money is left is going more and more to the superstars at the top. This is called the blockbuster effect. So for example, in the 1980s, 80% of revenue in the music business went to the top 20% of artists. Today, 80% of revenue in the music business goes to the top 1% of artists. In the art world, so-called, the world of painting, sculpture, and other unique objects, the gallery world, 64% of annual global revenue by sales of work by living artists, 64% goes to 20 people. 20 people. The other most important piece of bad news is that costs are up. For while production and distribution may now be cheap or free, although production often isn't very cheap, those are not the two main costs of making art. This is something that the Silicon Valley people don't understand. The two main costs of making art are staying alive while you make it and becoming an artist in the first place. And both of those costs have been soaring. Staying alive means principally rent, and median rent is up 62% that's adjusted for inflation since 2000. Also remember that many artists pay a double rent, one rent for living space, one for studio space. Becoming an artist means at a minimum time, and time again means staying alive, means rent, food, clothes, transportation. It means equipment. Software also isn't cheap, those kinds of specialized software. But above all, for most artists, becoming an artist almost certainly means going to school after high school, college at least, perhaps an MFA. And tuitions, as students of all people should know, have been rising for years. That's the bad news. What's the good news? The internet has indeed created tons of new opportunities. You can teach classes, give workshops, do commercial work, client work, find new ways to be recognized by the gatekeepers of the culture industry, the labels, the publishers, the galleries, the critics, producers, dealers, and all in many more ways than you used to be able to do. But more importantly, the internet has indeed enabled you to circumvent the gatekeepers altogether by appealing directly to the audience. This is the central sort of business model of the artist in the internet age. This has been the great promise of the digital age for artists and for many others, appealing directly to your audience without intermediaries. So yes, you can post your visual art on Instagram. You can put up your music on Spotify or YouTube. You can sell your stuff, your material objects on Etsy. You can self-publish your novel on one of any number of platforms. As people say, you can aggregate an audience and you can monetize it. This is the essential business model for almost everyone I talk to. Aggregate an audience, build an audience, monetize an audience. And one of the most important ways you can monetize that audience is through crowdfunding platforms, principally in the arts, Kickstarter and Patreon. Most of those 140 people I talked to were younger artists. They were under the age of 40. Almost every single one was either on Kickstarter or Patreon or both. The good news. But as I said, there's also bad news about the good news, and it comes in two main parts. First, while there are tons of new opportunities, there are millions of people pursuing them. And when I say millions, I mean millions. According to Billboard, I just heard this one, the number of musical acts that are now posting content on the internet worldwide is 25 million. As of 4 years ago, I'm sure the number's higher now, the number of books self-published each year was 1.7 million. That compares to about 75,000 books a year that come out from commercial or non-commercial academic presses, 1.7 million. Each year, about 13,000 films are submitted to Sundance, of which the festival accepts about 1.5%. Second piece of bad news about the good news. While you can do it yourself, you also have to do it yourself. I spent a lot of time in the book talking in granular detail about what that looks like, because this is what I want artists, and especially young artists, to understand. What does it mean now? What are the specifics? I talk in general, and I talk for each of the four main arts that I cover in the book: music, writing, visual art, and film and television. And to get really specific in each chapter, I have a chapter on each of those. I have 6 mini profiles of individual artists. The reason I do that is because every artist has a different way of putting together a living. Every artist has a different way of conducting their business. And the more models you hear about as a young artist, the better. I'm not going to get into all of that granular detail, but to speak broadly, what doing it yourself looks like is that you effectively function as a one-person small business, complete with production, management, and marketing departments. So that means dealing with nuts and bolts, like planning and running a tour, organizing a film shoot, shipping and invoicing artwork, handling clients, chasing down payments, attending to taxes and legal structures. All of those are things, or most of those are things that at an earlier time, somebody would have handled for you. And if you're very lucky, somebody still does, but in most cases, they don't. But it also means beyond the nuts and bolts, thinking strategically, seeing new openings, conducting market research, diversifying your product lines and income streams, developing and managing your brand. I talked to a guy named Andy J. Miller. Some of you may know him as Andy J. Pizza, which is his nom de podcast. He has a popular podcast called Creative Pep Talk, and he also teaches classes and writes books. He said, a career in creativity requires enormous amounts of creativity. You need to think of crafting your career as the ultimate creative project. He's an illustrator, and he said it's not going to just be break into editorial illustration and you're set. But necessity here is also opportunity. Artists now must, but also can, bring to their careers the same open-minded curiosity, the same ability to envision unexpected possibilities that they bring to their art. A writer said to me, the people I see getting depressed are people who don't see a path other than the one they aspired to 20 years ago. If you can be flexible, she said, you can do it. In other words, there's no such thing anymore as secluding yourself in your study or your studio. You have to stay in constant contact with the market. I talked to a musician and producer named Dan Barrett, who said, it's not enough to practice your craft every day. You also need to practice, as he said, networking, bookkeeping, watching trends. Most of his friends who are managing to have successful careers in music, he said, are extremely conscious about continuously evolving, changing, adapting, like any person in a technology-laden industry would have to be. And let me interrupt myself for a minute to make sure it's clear, in case it isn't already, that when I talk about illustrators or musicians or writers, I'm talking about all artists, whatever your field or medium. I'm talking about you. There are differences from field to field, but the things I'm talking about now in this talk are about trends and principles that cut across all of those fields. So if you hear me mention something that a musician says about music and you're not a musician, don't think that it doesn't apply to you. In any case, back to what I was saying. Since you're doing, in essence, two jobs, manager as well as maker, you need to develop a second, very different set of skills on top of your artistic ones. A number of people I talked to had made a point of giving themselves a kind of self-guided business degree. One was Dan Barrett, the musician I just referred to. He said that he had struggled for the first 10 years of his career as a musician, which is not uncommon among musicians and other artists. And he said, one day I realized it wasn't the music industry. It was me. I needed to adapt and I needed to understand business. So he read, he said, probably 300 books, business books and books on personal development and books on networking. And he learned a lot. And one of the things he learned is that, like any other business, you really do have to create something of objective value, by which he means something that other people are going to want to pay for, not just what you feel like making. And he also learned that most people aren't entrepreneurs. It's alarmingly democratic in that way, he said. To be a professional musician means that you're a successful entrepreneur, and most businesses fail. Or as I would put it, it's no more reasonable to think that every artist can become a business person than to think that every business person can become an artist. Okay, that's the practical side of what I write about. Now, I want to step back for a few minutes and talk about a theoretical issue. I talk about a number of them in the book, but one I want to emphasize in particular, and it may be the biggest question that the book engages, which is, how is all this changing art itself? Changing the role of the artist in society, changing the role of art in society. Because we don't always recognize this, those things have changed before. Our ideas about them are not eternal. And it's one of my points in the book that those ideas are conditioned by the material arrangements under which art is produced, or in plainer language, by the ways that artists get paid. When those shift, art shifts. Everything about art shifts. So in the book, very briefly, I outline 4 historical paradigms, or 3 paradigms, and then the new one, the 4th one, that I see us as having moved through. In the first paradigm, which prevailed up to, through, and even somewhat past the Renaissance, so really for centuries, if not millennia, quite frankly, artists were considered artisans. I mean, there's a reason that the 2 words are virtually identical. At that point, they were essentially identical. Artists were artisans, and nobody thought twice about exchanging art for cash. That's what you did, just like any other artisan. Artists were supported by various forms of patronage in Europe, by church, by crown, by the lord. And so their job was to give form to official or authorized truths. They did not speak their own truths. They did not speak truth to power. This is not an eternal attribute of artists. They said what the Pope wanted them to say, or whoever was, paying their lunch. It was only at the dawn of modernity, the decades around the turn of the 19th century, so 250 years ago, maybe the roots are a little older, that we witnessed the emergence of art with a capital A, meaning art as an autonomous realm of expression, not a subordinate realm of expression. This second paradigm prevailed until about the middle of the 20th century. So it starts in the Romantic period and it goes through what we call modernism. This was the age of the artist as solitary genius, as hero, revolutionary, prophet, not speaking the truths of power, but speaking truth to power. But ironically, the emergence of art as an autonomous realm of expression, that artistic freedom that we regard as fundamental to art, depended on the rise of capitalism, because it was capitalism, the market, that freed artists from subservience to patronage. It's ironic because it was only at that point that commerce came to be seen as antithetical to art, a corrupting influence on art. So artists dealt with that contradiction by dwelling on the margins of the market, out of conviction, also often out of necessity, because now, for the first time, artists, or most artists, were poor. This was also where the starving artist becomes a thing. It had not been a thing before that. I call the second paradigm, the first one was the artist as artisan. The second one is the artist as bohemian. It's during this time that bohemianism as a fact, as an idea, as an ideal, as well as the word bohemian, comes into being. Now, in many ways, this is still our idea of what the artist is. Certainly our ideal of what the artist is. The rebel, the marginalized. But the truth is that it's been obsolete for the better part of a century. After World War II in particular, starting a little bit between the wars, but especially after World War II, a third paradigm emerged. Now, this was the age of what we called the culture boom, of massive institution building across the arts. Museums, theaters, concert halls, orchestras, opera companies, ballet troupes, university art departments, university art schools, schools of design. I mean, these existed to a certain extent before that, but there's a huge explosion in these things. Foundations, residencies, arts councils. The NEA was founded in the 60s. The MFA had barely existed before the war. A few institutions offered MFAs. Suddenly, well over 100, and now hundreds, of course. And the migration of artists of all kinds into university employment. That's the nonprofit side. On the for-profit side, there was a comparable building out of the arts infrastructure, what we now call the culture industry. Labels, studios, galleries, publishers, magazines. In short, art was institutionalized, which means that the artist became a product and a denizen of institutions, meaning a professional. Not someone who stands like the bohemian on the fringes of the market, but who's protected from the market by the mediation of institutions. You work at a university, you don't have to worry about paying the bills. The administration worries about that, about donors and tuition and all that stuff. If you have a relationship with a gallery, it's the dealer who deals with the clients. It's that paradigm that has been breaking down in the age of the internet. All of those institutions are under economic attack, most of them directly or indirectly from the internet economy. Which means, in what I call the fourth paradigm, artists now both can and must stand alone within the marketplace without institutional protection. They must be, as I described it before, one-person small businesses. The implications of this for the nature of art, as I tease them out in the book, are too numerous for me to go into, but I'll only say the most important one. That what's at stake is whether art, if it has to serve its masters in the market, can retain its independence as an autonomous realm of expression, a way to speak new truths. What's at stake, in other words, is the freedom of the artist. I'm just going to talk for a few more minutes. We've talked about the practical situation in broad terms. I've talked about the changing nature of the artist's role into society. I want to circle back to practicalities, but in a different way. One of the most interesting things for me in writing the book and doing the interviews is that as I listened to people's stories, I started to get a sense of kind of the generic shape of an artist's career. And since I'm talking, I hope, to a lot of students, I think it's important to know what that shape looks like. It's quite distinctive from other people. First, the part that you've already lived through, which is childhood and adolescence. One of the striking things for me was the consistency with which my subjects told me that they always knew they wanted to be artists from a very young age. This is not true of other professions. Another striking thing is that so few of them received any kind of support, psychological support in particular, for wanting to be artists. On the contrary, what they received was relentless resistance from parents, peers, schools, the general environment. In fact, going back to Andy Miller, my illustrator, the reason he devoted himself to assisting young artists, he told me, is first of what he saw with his mother. He said she's a creative person who's lived the tragic artist's life, all this potential, all these paths she could have taken, but the environment in which she was raised never gave her any clear idea of what you could do with that type of talent. As a child, he was told that he was often like her, by which people meant highly creative. But he said, by the time I was a teenager, I was watching her life unravel, and it was like a prophetic vision of my future. In high school, his peer group consisted of people like him and his mom, and a lot of them also ended up crashing and burning. So then a few years later, he's reading about people like Steve Jobs, who are idolized in the business world as, these preternaturally creative types who are one in a million. And he thought, these people are just like my friends. I kept thinking these people are everywhere. You just don't have any metrics to recognize their value. The problem lies, he believes, in the educational system. Creative IQ, he said, doesn't correlate with what we traditionally think of as regular intelligence or IQ. The hyper-creative people are not necessarily showing up on the tests. He said he described his own experience as being like a penguin in a pigeon's world. All the tests he got were like flying tests. Everybody around me seemed to be soaring with ease. Discovering design and illustration, he said, was like finding water for the first time. Penguins can fly, he said, just in water. So that's the first part of the life cycle with which I take it a lot of you will be familiar. Here's the next part. You've run the gauntlet of discouragement and you still think that you want to be an artist. Maybe because you were born knowing that you were going to be an artist. You graduate from college or you finish your MFA or you don't go to college at all. And typically you move to a center to make it, New York, Chicago, LA, maybe a smaller center. The first thing that happens is you go from hero to zero. In school, your teachers and your peers paid attention to you. Now no one gives a shit because you are shit. Now you're being compared not to the rest of the class, but to the rest of the world. The way forward at that point is to embrace your awfulness and just get on with it. A musician said, you have to be okay with being bad. Bad in public, bad repeatedly, bad for a long time. An independent film director talked about his first years after college. He said it was that period that anyone involved in the creative arts goes through in their 20s, where they try to figure out who they are and what their work's actually about and what they want to do. He said you need to have time to grind it out creatively, which is really hard. It's really hard to do that. You have to put yourself through a lot of soul searching and self-hatred and self-loathing in order to develop. The question becomes, once reality has punched you in the face, is whether you're going to go on, whether you're going to commit. This is a pivotal moment in the life of any artist. But if you get through it, eventually you get your big break and you're set for life. That's actually a joke. That's not what happens at all. Usually you just keep doing your work. Work generates work. People are always on the lookout for talent. You make connections, you become better known. You get a lot of rejections always, but maybe somebody takes a chance on you. With progress as slow, as uncertain, and as frequently unfair as it typically is, staying the course requires great tenacity and self-belief, as well, ideally, as a kind of serenity or acceptance. As one musician said, it's a matter of being a lifer, of knowing with instinctive clarity that this is what you should be doing with yourself. But most important, I would say, in persisting is a sense of dedication to the work itself, for its own sake, rather than for any possible reward. That musician I just mentioned said, it's about not expecting a lot. I think that a lot of young kids move to New York and they're hungry and they really want success and they want it to look a certain way and they almost start to feel entitled to it. And in my experience, sometimes the less you expect from something, the more you get from it, she said. Still, many artists reach a point of no return, where they feel the need to choose definitively whether to go on. I heard about this over and over again. It typically comes at some point in your 30s. You've served your apprenticeship, you've done the right things, you may even have had a few successes, but you haven't gotten the kind of traction that would make you feel like you're actually getting somewhere. Being a struggling artist was glamorous when you were 28, not when you were 38. If you're going to have find an off-ramp, if you're going to go to that plan B that you've been talking about or start developing one, then now's the time. There can be tremendous shame involved in giving up, a sense of having failed yourself, of surrendering to conventional existence, of looking foolish in the eyes of the world for having even tried in the first place. But dropping out is often precisely the right thing to do. Giving yourself permission not to be an artist can be as liberating and as brave as allowing yourself to try to be one in the first place. But look, some artists do achieve success. There's no question about it. It doesn't usually look like our typical image of success, you know, the breakout song, the breakout role, the rapid ascent to wealth and fame. Again, it's usually gradual. It usually just keeps going, project to project. All of which explains the most remarkable fact about success in the arts, that for most artists, once they've reached a certain point in life, success is defined as just continuing to be an artist. Simply having the ability to do your work full-time and on your own terms. Every additional year is a victory. Of course, no one gets to that position right away. No young artist dreams of just making work. You know, you want to be Picasso, you want to be Kanye. But slowly, painfully, as with any youthful dream, you adjust your way down to reality. And if you're lucky, you get to make work your whole life. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Bill and I had a chance to talk a little bit before. We had like a pre-conversation before the conversation. So I've already had a chance to really tap into some questions, but this is, as I promised everybody, important and provocative. And I think before I weigh in with any thoughts, I really want to see questions from our faculty and students and others that are joining. I might just say, you know, what resonated with you, what didn't resonate with you. That's an easy sort of way to get you thinking about, you know, activating an engagement here with this important topic. But DB, I'm not sure if you are channeling questions through YouTube or chat, but I leave it to you to figure out how we harvest the questions.
We don't currently have any questions on YouTube, but Bill, that was a very intriguing, thought-provoking talk. I'm very curious what our faculty will respond to with this. I'm very curious about Stephen's question as a result of what resonates and doesn't.
Me too.
Well, I'd like to ask a question, if you don't mind. So the question that I have is, you're going through the historical perspective of how art and artisans kind of came to be and survived and created and produced and shared their work, and moving into now, thinking about this great proliferation. And so I'm wondering if you can kind of think forward about all the changes, you know, so certainly, like, I guess my question is, do you imagine something cyclical happening? Do you see things filtering back down because of this? And what shifts might you see related to internet technologies that would kind of channel this and shape this movement in the future? Thanks.
It's a good question, but I also I don't like to answer questions about the future, because I feel like it's hard enough to talk about the present, let alone the past, and the future I can't see because it hasn't happened yet. I think the best way to predict the future is by looking at the present. I certainly don't see any reason why it should be cyclical. I don't think things work like that. You know, what I see now is that people have to, because everything pays so little, because the competition for attention is so fierce, people have to have not one eye, but two eyes constantly on what's going to immediately get people's attention. And I don't think that's a great way to make art. But the Dean and I, before, in our pre-conversation he just referred to, we're talking about, you know, standards of value in art, standards of what is good in art. And it may well be that young people now are very happy with the art they're getting and think that that is what good art is. And there's no objective place from which to stand and say, you're wrong. But I think that artists, I mean, the artists I talk to are finding it harder and harder to find a kind of stillness, a kind of solitude from which they feel they can create from a deeper place. Now, are there going to be new structures that help alleviate some of these pressures? Maybe that's really what you're asking. I don't know. But given the architecture of the internet, it's hard to see what those would be. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I think people have tried to do this, but not too successfully from what I can tell. It's not scalable. I mean, I think there are various initiatives that are trying to help artists, and that's all terrific, but none of them are happening at scale. I mean, at this 25 million people posting music. So maybe you're helping a few dozen people, and that's great.
This stage, I would invite those, at least on Zoom, to just unmute and jump in.
So I have a question, Bill. not an artist. So I come from, the science engineering kind of training, but I am in this mix and I have this question weighing on me all the time. The way you contrasted Silicon Valley's response to the lived, felt experience of artists, I wanted to ask you for some clarity around what is an artist. So the 125 people that you chose, who were, again, de-anonymized, but were these, what is an artist? Yeah.
Right. That's certainly a good question. And one of the features of, as I suggest, everyone's an artist. One of the features of the way that we've been thinking about art in the internet age is I would say, a radical expansion of that category of artist. And I know a lot of people want to claim that term, and I will probably argue with them about it. And let me stipulate by saying first that I am not an artist. I'm a writer, I'm not an artist. And I'm perfectly happy saying that I'm not an artist. So as I said, I guess my definition is traditional, but it's not my definition because it's traditional. To me, art is music, it's literature, it's narrative film, whether fiction or nonfiction. It is visual art. My technical definition, which I don't think I present in the book, is that art is something that makes meaning by embodying meaning in form, right? Art creates meaning through form. As the great Ursula K. Le Guin said, the artist says what cannot be said in words. And she says, the writer does this in words. The writer says in words what cannot be, the novelist, what cannot be said in words. What does that mean? They say it through form. There are many areas of life that involve creativity that I would not call art. That may be the distinction you're looking for or that makes sense to you. You may still say they are art. Writing code is art. Conducting scientific research is art. I don't think so. They're creative. They're not art. Why do they have to be art? It's okay not to be art.
No, that is very helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
I think, the creation of a form that communicates.
Of meaningful form. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another question from YouTube. I'll read it for us. It's from Becky. Let's see what we have here. To break this artist solitude and one-man shops, is there any hope for reemergence of artist communities?
That's a good question. I think there are artist communities. I think they tend often not to be known outside of their own communities. One of the things that I was struck with in doing my research was the level of mutual help among artists. Mutual help of all kinds, referral to, I heard about this cheap apartment that just opened up, or let's collaborate, or whatever it is. And there are many, many structures, informal and formal. If you mean literal communities where people live in the same area, bohemias, there are, but the problem with that is the gentrification cycle and how those tend to get cannibalized as they become cool places because artists live there. But in terms of a community that's really going to make a difference in the economic situation of artists, that's a little harder because I talked about the mutual aid, which is a big thing, but it requires real commitment and sacrifice that people's individual life projects might interfere with, if you understand what I'm saying. Like, how stable is this community going to be? How much are we going to help each other make a living, or are we just going to support each other psychologically, socially, as we each confront this machine out there that we each individually have to make our living through?
Bill, I've seen David grab his beard, and I know enough from David that means he has something he would like to say. So, is that true? Oh,
you're on mute, Dave.
Yeah, it's a nervous tick. I'm not used to the beard. I'm trying to formulate a question here. I reread, thanks for the talk. I really enjoyed this. I reread an older essay of yours, the neoliberal arts.
Yeah.
I think it was from 2015.
2015. Yeah.
So I did a BFA and an MFA, but I didn't. I don't know how to paint or draw even, which is weird. But I don't. I use a computer. So I think what I liked about art school was the way they think and learn. And something resonated in that article that I reread this morning. Well, a couple things you said. You said, no one wants you to become an artist. No one wants anyone to become an artist anymore. So artists are recast as creatives, or you do design thinking or something like that, where the focus is on devising innovative products, rather than, and what I think maybe artists do more of is seeking fundamental change, and that seeking fundamental change is just, we can't. Liberalism in essence, you said that's out. In neoliberalism, you can't think about fundamental changes to society, and I don't think all artists do that, but some do. And I think when we generally think about fine art and artists in the art world, we're thinking about people who have no boundaries. They can completely reimagine the way we live.
Yeah. Specifically in that passage you quoted, I'm talking about how creativity has become this big ideal in colleges and universities now. But I want people to understand that by creativity, they don't mean that they want you to be an artist, because they want people. Well, I don't want to be cynical, but artists don't tend to be big donors as alumni because they don't have a lot of money. But also what you're saying about fundamental change, but even just unpredictable change, unpredictable imagination. I quote Amy Whitaker, that wonderful scholar writer, in her book Art Thinking, where she talks about the difference between design thinking and art thinking. In design thinking, you can say, creative person, I need you to design this, and they can do a good job. But with art, it's not, because it's open-ended, because you don't know where you're going. No one can sort of rely on you to produce the answer to the problem that they have, the solution to the problem they have. So it doesn't have that kind of commercial value. Listen, we've always been a pretty practical civilization in the United States, and artists have never had the kind of position that they have in France, Italy, whatever. But it hasn't always been as bad as it is now. There was a period, again, that post-World War II culture boom, which was also sort of the great age of the New Deal and the Great Society and the growing middle class, where we opened ourselves up to more possibilities in life. And now the economic and institutional space has just gotten so shrunk. And as a result, the imaginative space has as well.
Well, can I ask a follow-on? What do you think of, I'm contrasting that with this impression of things like YouTube, where, millions of people get paid fairly significant amounts of money for making content for YouTube, and they think of themselves as digital creatives. And in some ways, it's incredible. There's so much astoundingly creative stuff happening on YouTube all the time. It's drowned out. It's dwarfed by the amount of garbage on YouTube, but if you can find the stuff, it's out there, and it's there's a lot of it. And people are paying for it.
I'm not sure that you might disagree. I'm not sure that the most interesting creative stuff maps onto the stuff that's making millions of dollars.
Right.
Again, there's this huge blockbuster economics where there are a few people, because it's a virality, right? It's the dynamics of virality. So the big get bigger. But you're right. Maybe even if it's not making millions or even thousands of dollars, YouTube is this tremendous platform to be people to do wonderfully creative stuff. As I said at the beginning of my talk, the internet has been great for creativity in a lot of ways. But as always, Mike, the question I'm asking here is, those creative people on YouTube, how are they going to be able to sustain that? And it's not through YouTube, because YouTube pays almost nothing.
Hey, Bill, can I Can I jump in? This is Joe Watson. Hey,
Hi.
I really appreciated your comments tonight, and quite enlightening, sobering, but in line with my thinking. I don't know if that's good or bad. I don't know what camp that puts you and I in, but I very much enjoyed them, and particularly wanted to get your insights on a couple of things. One is you raised the question of really, at this point, in some ways, an existential threat to potentially to the livelihood and to the very existence of free art and creatives and artists pursuing their craft in an entrepreneurial sense. And I'm particularly interested because you taught this question about to be a successful artist these days. Now going forward, you have to be a successful entrepreneur. In essence, a one-person small business, which I don't think can be emphasized enough, but we'll put that to the side. My question, my first question is there some place that you're seeing that done exceptionally well as it relates to the artistic community? You know, there's a lot of noise and chatter and kind of online business this and entrepreneurial that, but you know, in the artistic creative space, I think there's a different sensibility. I think there's a need to approach that a bit differently while conveying the same information. One, are you seeing it any place? Two, if you're not seeing it any place, or if you just pause for a moment, if you were to design it, just in 60 seconds or less, what would what would it look like?
I'm not sure I'm equipped to answer your question. I don't see it in any particular place. Among the people I talk to, and also other people that I've learned about, some people are doing it well and some people are not doing it as well. It tends to require tremendous energy. Again, that kind of flexibility to continue to imagine sort of new ways of, quite frankly, new ways of making money, new ways of putting your stuff out there, new ways of packaging your stuff. So there are individuals undoubtedly everywhere who are doing it well. I can't say that there's any place that I've noticed that it clusters. I'm going to assume you're on the faculty here, and I'm going to say that this may not be the question you're asking, but I have a whole chapter in the book on art schools and how do art schools need to respond to this. Mm-hmm. And I talk about the two poles of the practical and the sort of ideal, and how in some schools, they still haven't broken out of the ideal, like you're a solitary, you're just do your work and you'll, it'll be fine. And then I think the majority of schools have said, no, we really need to get on this, but they've gone too far in the other direction and they've turned everything into practicality. So to me, the question is, how do you thread the needle? How do you help young artists learn to make the work that they need to make, that they are artists to make, but also support themselves? And I talk about, I don't want to go on too long. I don't know if our time is running short, but I talk about Susan Solt, who when she was at CalArts taught, I guess, the first classes in arts entrepreneurship. And she thought it was going to be a nuts and bolts course, and the nuts and bolts are important. But what she ended up starting with is a very deep process of self-investigation. Why are you doing this? What do you want to make? Let's figure that out now. Let's figure how who's doing something like what you're doing and managing to support themselves. And it doesn't have to be in the market. It can be through nonprofits, through foundations and grants and so forth, right? So I think that's what's important. As I say in the book, you need to be in the market, but to protect yourself from being of the market, from being possessed by the market. Does that help at all?
Yeah, no, it does, very much so. And I think speaks to a lot of issues. I have follow-ons, but I'm not going to ask them because I see a couple of great questions in chat. And one in particular I'd love to point you towards is this question: are NFTs sustainable from a monetization perspective, and what's your point of view? Not to take you from an easy one to an easy
No, it's okay. I mean, everyone now, for months now, everyone's been asking me about NFTs. And I can't say that I have a highly developed opinion about them, at least not one that's significantly different from what I've already been talking about. It seems to me that NFTs, they're a new monetization opportunity. They also seem to me to be a giant bubble of hype. But most importantly, I think they're going to follow. I think that we started to hear about them because they've already been following the blockbuster distribution model. So that whoever that person was who got $60 million for an NFT, and so suddenly everybody's rushing to do NFTs. You know, it's like podcasting, right? You know, everybody knows about Joe Rogan and how much money he's making. So now everyone's doing a podcast. So now there are like literally a couple of million podcasts. And most of them are making literally no money. So maybe NFTs are going to stick around and be this new thing, and maybe they won't. But I don't see why they would change the basic economic dynamics. Do you, I know I don't have the person who answered the question here, but you were interested in that question. So what do you think?
Well, I mean, what I'll say is just reading it, I'm curious. I think like all things, you have speculative bubbles, and America is truly great at those, right? And so those who have, entered the water first will do exceedingly well. And then over time, obviously, you'll have that which washes up on shore, right? So I think that's part of it. But I do think that there is a deep potential for, particularly in the online world, as that continues to develop through the, metaverse, which is just the internet, as we all know, and other things. I think it's real there. And I think that there will be a consistent push by industry to move the American consumer online, because if you think about it, in the world of online and the metaverse, the consumption capacity is literally has no limit, right? You run out of things on the shelf at Trader Joe's, you run out of things in Best Buy. You never run out of things in the metaverse, right? So folks can spend forever. And, we've proven ourselves extremely adept at separating consumers from their remuneration, shall we say. So I expect that to fully continue.
Right. I see. So in some sense, the larger point is that art will increasingly migrate online. Not just that it's sold online, but that will increasingly take the form of digital objects.
Yeah, I believe that pretty strongly.
I think that's a pretty good guess.
Yeah, and when I think it has, I think certain degree, it's a generational split that you'll see, because we have to keep in mind those that are, call it sub 25, their relationship with the internet and technology is vastly different than anybody over 25. It is night and day. So yeah, I think there's no question that's going to happen.
There's some great questions and comments on in our chat, but DB, I know we're close to the end of the time, so I will. Should we continue to entertain a few more, or
I'd be happy to.
We done?
If it's possible, could I ask a question? I'm a student at ASU.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Please, Logan.
So you outlined a difference between creatives and artists. I recently just read a book in one of my classes. I'm not sure if you're familiar. Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Where he kind of outlines that there's this life has unavoidable suffering, that one of the things that people need to do during life is to learn how to cope and deal with that suffering, because it's going to be unavoidable regardless of which path you go down. So I was going to go ask a question. At what point does suffering become a byproduct of following your passions, and at what point is it the byproduct of being an artist, and what is that difference, and to what scale, like race scale, is following your passions different from being an artist, and the separation that you kind of seem to hint at come into play?
Well, I mean, following your passion can mean any kind of passion whatsoever. I mean, you can follow your passion to become a doctor, right? Veterinarian, whatever. I think it's true that one often needs to be comfortable with the idea of following your passion in order to become an artist, because the other kinds of rewards, the money, status, power, you're not going to get. So you need to have that inner drive and inner permission, inner freedom to become an artist in most cases, probably. Then it sounded like you were asking about whether there's a necessary connection between suffering and art.
It's more so how, let's say for someone who may feel alienated because they may not consider themselves an artist, or by your definition, a creative versus an artist.
Mm-hmm.
is there value that they can be drawing from your book or what you're saying? And are these contingent specifically on just being an artist, or following a path in life that isn't necessarily the norm or is more based off of passion?
Well, really, my last book, Excellent Sheep, is much more relevant to that question. I mean, it's all about that question, about following your passion as opposed to jumping through the hoops and doing what your parents want you to do. I don't mean to denigrate people who aren't artists by any means. Like I said, I'm not an artist. You don't have to be an artist. Is this new book, The Death of the Artist, relevant to people who aren't artists? It's a very practical book about making your way in the world. I would say if you are someone who's producing digital content as an independent creator, whether I would call you an artist or not, it's a very relevant book because it's about the economics of that. That's why, I mean, it partly grows out of my experience, even though I'm not an artist, because I am a writer and I'm an independent writer.
Thank you.
And I'm wondering if we can ask just one final question of you to kind of wrap things up here.
Sure.
We have a question from Christy Spackman that is, what can help artists with this mental, emotional, and physical mountain of 21st century practice?
Let me first say what I want to make sure to say, which is that I did not write this book and I'm not giving this talk to discourage anyone. I think if you feel that you have a calling to be an artist, you should pursue it. I have nothing but the highest esteem for artists. That's why I wrote the book. Art has been incredibly important in my life, and there's no art without artists, despite what we seem to think. You know, but you're asking, how do you cope with the challenges? I think what somebody said earlier, community. I think having community with other artists, with other people who are going through it, who understand what you're going through, who validate what you're going through, is incredibly important. You know, all the things that you can do to sort of take self-care, to take, you know, to, yeah. I also, I mean, I say this with respect to the Excellent Sheep themes more often, but I like to say, especially the young people, that the greatest gift you can give yourself is to not care what other people think about your choices, including, you know, the people who brought you into the world, maybe your friends who are not, who think that what you're doing is crazy. And all you have to do, in a certain sense, not to care, is just not to care.
Thank you so much for answering that final question. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us today. It was a really interesting conversation. Thank you.
My pleasure. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Great conversation, Bill.
Okay.
Just brilliant thinking. We really appreciate your time.
Okay. Thank you so much.